Welcome back to Take Care with the Rowing Therapist, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, stronger, and more connected lives. I'm your host, Danielle Wagmeister, and today's guest is someone whose personal story has not only inspired me, but has also changed the lives of thousands of families around the world. Dr. Mary Newport is a physician, a researcher, and was her husband's caregiver. As a neonatologist, she spent decades helping sick and premature infants survive and thrive. When her husband Steve was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, she found herself in a new and deeply personal battle, one that led her to discover the therapeutic potential of ketones for the aging brain. She first shared their journey in the groundbreaking book, Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Is a Cure?, a title that sparked a worldwide conversation and gave hope to families who had been told there was none. Just finished reading the book myself. Highly recommend it. Full of great information. I learned a lot and very inspiring testimonies. So I definitely recommend that you check that one out. Since then, she continues to educate and advocate through her other works, including the coconut oil and low-carb solution for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other diseases. I have a copy of it here. The complete book of ketones, and clearly keto for healthy brain aging and Alzheimer's prevention. Today, Dr. Newport joins us to talk not only about Steve's story, but about what she has learned over the past 16 years, how to identify early warning signs of cognitive decline, what labs and lifestyle changes can make the biggest difference, and how a simple, affordable strategy like MCT oil might be one of the most powerful tools we have. Just to note, the information contained today is for information purposes only and does not constitute medical advice, nor does it establish a doctor-patient relationship. Dr. Newport, thank you so much for being here. Would you be willing to start by sharing a little about Steve's story? What happened when you began experimenting with MCT oil?
Right.
Yeah.
First, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
Oh,
It
of
was
course.
fantastic. Yeah. So, as you said, I worked in newborn intensive care, for 30 years, and he did accounting for my practice. He was able to work from home since I was based in the hospital, and it made it very wonderful, for our family because he could stay home and take care of our children. When I had emergencies, I had to run off a lot, day and night to deliveries and that type of thing. So he was going along nicely. He did a great job as an accountant. He was a perfectionist. And when he was about 51 years old, he started having problems with remembering things. Basically, he would forget about appointments. Even if I would call him a half hour ahead of time to remind him, he would forget about an appointment that our daughters had. He would forget to go. It was interesting. He started hanging notes, little post-it notes on tape in doorways to remind him about things he was supposed to do. At first I really didn't think too much about it. I thought, okay, he's middle-aged now, 51, and maybe he's just so busy that he needs these reminders. But then he started having trouble remembering if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And I think that's something that most of us at that age, would remember, whether we had done that. It was part of his job that he would go to the bank and post office every day, and he would forget. And then he would misplace important mail, checks from payments, that type of thing. And so it became very worrisome at that point. And he was also quite depressed. That was probably one of his very earliest symptoms, was depression. And we kind of attributed it to our daughters were teenagers, and life had gotten a little more complicated at that point. But in reality, he later said that he knew for several years before I caught on that something was wrong. He knew that his brain wasn't functioning as well as it used to, and that was making him very depressed. He just didn't share that with me, for a while. But nevertheless, when he was 54 years old, he was diagnosed officially with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So this was 3 years after we started noticing these symptoms. And It took maybe 2 more years for him to not be able to drive or even turn on a computer, which he had worked on all day. Couldn't do any simple math, couldn't use a calculator. This was age 54. So he was progressing very quickly. And then, when I was working, I mean, people with Alzheimer's, this doesn't happen like overnight for most people. It's a very slow process. So you kind of gradually get used to some of these changes that you're seeing. But then, certain things just really start striking you. Okay, this is clearly not normal. Like forgetting about the going to the bank and the post office. But I had a particularly bad summer in the Newport ICU in August, which was usually the busiest month. And I would come home and he hadn't eaten. And he had lost, I realized he looked like he was losing weight, and he had lost about 10 pounds in a month. And just simply from not eating. He thought he had eaten, but he hadn't. He had been able to fix meals for himself. And so one of our daughters, reluctantly, she came home and she started staying, and being there with him, when I was working. And I really appreciate all of her efforts on that. It really kind of sidetracked her in many ways. Which happens to many family members when you're dealing with Alzheimer's. And so this was 2007 that, I noticed this weight loss, that he started really needing constant supervision. And then in 2008, I really felt like we were at a point where he had declined so much that I didn't know if we would have him, for more than 2 or 3 more years. So there were a couple of clinical trials that became available in our area. And these were drugs that remove plaques from the brain. There's a lot of controversy about those now, about whether this is even the main problem, which has been really the focus of research for decades now, trying to remove plaques from the brain. And but there were 2 different drugs that became available in our area at that time. That was our best hope. We didn't know that there were controversies yet about this. And he was scheduled 2 days in a row to try out, for 2 different clinical trials. And I happened to be on the internet the night before the first screening. And I was looking at the 2 drugs to see the risks and benefits. And, if he got accepted into both trials, we would have to pick one. So that's why I was researching this. But this press release popped up about a medical food that was going to come out about a year later. And in a pilot study of just 1 dose, and in a 3-month study of basically 152 people, they had found that nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's who took this medical food had improved cognition, memory and cognition on cognitive testing. And this is not something you have ever heard about Alzheimer's drugs. None of them have ever been able to claim that they improve cognition. So this was of great interest to me, and I was able to find their patent application. They didn't really explain how it worked in the press release, but I found their patent application, and I learned a few things about Alzheimer's disease, that it's a type of diabetes of the brain. Some people call it that, but it's basically insulin resistance in the brain. It's very much like type 2 diabetes, that you have insulin resistance, but it's affecting the brain. In this case, they found this by doing autopsies of the brains of people who had died with Alzheimer's, and they didn't have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but they did have diabetes of the brain. So they started calling it Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. And so the interesting idea that came from developing this medical food, which turned out to be MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, is that when you consume it, no matter what you eat, part of it is converted to ketones. And ketones are an alternative fuel to glucose for the brain. So when you have insulin resistance, cells are resistant to taking up glucose. They're not responding to insulin normally. Most cells require insulin to get glucose into the cell. And glucose is the primary fuel for cells when you are on a typical higher carb diet. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, which I suspect we'll be talking about too, you eat more fat, you eat much less carbohydrate. It kind of mimics fasting. and you break down fat, and some of that fat is converted to ketones, which fuels your brain in that situation. So this is a really cool way to be able to take something that would convert to ketones that can provide fuel to the brain. So this was really a brilliant idea. And I thought, okay, the science sounds very, well, I should say it sounds very sound. It made sense to me. And I thought, okay, this is something we need to try. Then I'm looking at this, it's about 1 a.m. and he's supposed to screen around 9 a.m. So I didn't have time to go out and do anything about it. The other thing I had learned from the patent application was that MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil, which was new to me. And I was familiar with MCT oil because we had used it in the practice taking care of sick and premature newborns back in the early 80s when I was in training. We used to add a little bit to each feeding of our tiniest preemies, and they would grow better, they would get home faster. And then infant formula manufacturers started adding it directly to premature infant formulas and formulas for newborns who were having like intestinal issues with the formula. So, and then they also started adding coconut oil to try to mimic the fats that are in breast milk, which include medium chain triglycerides. So I learned so much about just from that patent application. Anyway, he went for the screening in the morning. It was around 9 a.m. and he did not do well. He needed to score at least 16 out of 30 points on the mini mental status exam, and he scored only 14 points. So he did not qualify for the study. We were devastated, and the doctor asked him to draw a clock, which I can actually show you. I'll try to show it. Okay. So you can see this is supposed to be a clock. It's just a few little random circles and a few numbers.
Yeah.
And the doctor, it was very disorganized, and she told me he's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, which I kind of knew, but boy, that really brought it home. To see that was really something. And so I thought, okay, we're going to do this. So on the way home, I knew I had seen coconut oil in health food stores. I hadn't really seen MCT oil anywhere. Didn't know that it was available. So I picked up coconut oil. When we got home, I looked up the composition of coconut oil, the fatty acid composition, and I learned that it was about 60% medium chain triglycerides. And there's arguments about which are the medium chain triglycerides, but in this case, you know, the information I had, it was, 60%. And so I tried to calculate the dose of the medical food that they had been using in their studies, and it was 20 grams. And this brought the coconut oil up to about a little over 2 tablespoons. And so the next day, he was scheduled again to try out for a clinical trial. And I gave him, it was 35 grams, a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil. I had mixed it into oatmeal because coconut oil is a little bit semi-solid at room temperature. And 4 hours later, he screened for the second trial. It was in a different location, different drug, different floor of the building. He gained 4 points. And the point that he gained, and he qualified for the study, which like a miracle at the time. And that's a very significant increase of 4 points from the day before. And there were things like the town that we were in, the floor on the institution, and the day of the week and the season. He had gotten all of those wrong the day before. And 3 of those were different. They were actually different than the day before. So he qualified, and I thought, okay, we're going to keep this going. And I didn't know for sure if we just got lucky or not right away. But within 4 or 5 days, it was obvious that something was working. And so I started giving him that same amount for breakfast every day. And then I had read in the patent application that the ketone levels from taking MCT oil tend to peak at 90 minutes, and they're pretty much back to where you started at 3 hours. And I thought, wait a minute, the brain needs fuel 24/7. Even when you're sleeping, the brain needs a tremendous amount of fuel. And so I thought, I'm going to start giving him this at each meal, some at each meal. And I got recipes online. We went back to the health food store, got some coconut oil cookbooks, and just started adding it. And over the next few days, he had just changes right away. He said it felt like a light bulb came on in his brain the day he started the coconut oil. He said that many times, including
Wow.
that day. And
Wow.
yeah, and he had tremors, like he had a tremor in his hand when he would try to eat. And he had a tremor in his jaw when he would talk. He would have trouble finishing sentences and his jaw would quiver as he was trying to figure out what to say. That stopped right away. And the hand shaking, it sometimes he would have it in the morning, but it would go away after 20 or 30 minutes after getting the coconut oil.
Wow.
And then he walked very stiffly, very slowly and stiffly. He couldn't run anymore, and this had been for a while, maybe close to a year. And at 2 months, he could pick up he was walking normally. He started walking more quickly that second day and for the
Wow.
next few days. But over about 2 months, his gait completely normalized, became completely normal. He could pick up his feet and run again. He
Wow.
wasn't stiff. And the other interesting thing at 2 months is he could tie his shoes again, which he hadn't been able to do for a while. And
Wow.
that's really a big deal when you have to
Yes.
tie somebody's shoes for them, and then you don't have to. That's really surprising. He felt much better, and after 4 or 5 days, I mean, we talked about it. He said, things have changed. Something has changed here, and I became very overwhelmed because I thought, here's a medical food. They're not expecting it to come out for a year. It's on the shelf. you know, this is something that
Yeah.
people can get, and I need to like tell the whole world about it because at that time they were saying there were about 35,000 people with dementia worldwide. Now it's 55,000 is what the estimate is, and about
Yes.
60 or 70% of those are Alzheimer's disease.
Yes,
So
and probably climbing with the fact that it's tied to insulin resistance,
yes,
which I'm hearing is somewhere between 91 and 93% of our population.
that's probably true.
Yeah.
It's happening more and more in children even. It used to be called adult onset diabetes, and then juvenile onset was type 1. And they kind of abandoned that and they just call it type 2 because so many teenagers and even young children are developing insulin resistance. A lot of people have fatty liver, younger people, and that
I've
ties
heard
into
that.
insulin resistance. It's a common complication of diabetes, and obesity, of course, has become a big problem. This is all kind of evolving since kind of the 1960s, really gained steam in the 1980s, and has been getting worse ever since. And diabetes has is really more than doubled over the last 20 years in the United States. And pre-diabetes, more people are getting screened for it. A lot of people never get screened for it. A
Yeah.
lot of doctors, they'll check your fasting glucose, and if it's under 100, they think, oh, okay, you don't have insulin resistance. But I think it's really a good idea to check beyond that, check hemoglobin A1C, which gives you an idea of what glucose is over several months. That kind of averages your glucose, and a fasting insulin level can tell you when somebody has insulin resistance or insulin level gets very high, the cells
Yeah.
start responding to it.
Yes,
So,
I've actually heard Dr. Ben Bickman talk
mhm,
about the fact that you can have normal glucose
mhm,
levels for
right,
decades as
mhm,
your insulin levels are
or
increasing. And so
increasing.
it is better to look at the biomarker of insulin over that. And then I wonder if you could tell our listeners a little bit about an ApoE score and if that's something that they might want to have their doctor assess.
Yeah. So ApoE4, there are these ApoE genes. We get one from each parent, and somebody that is ApoE2 has a very low risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Somebody who is ApoE3, they got a 3 from each parent, is has about it's slightly under 5% risk of developing Alzheimer's. If you have one copy of the ApoE4 gene, it increases your risk to about 12 to 13%. And if you have two copies of the ApoE4 gene, one from each parent, your risk goes up to about 40%. So ApoE4 seems to be really the best known genetic risk factor, for Alzheimer's. And there have been studies, looking at glucose uptake in the brain. They can do imaging studies to look for this. And people as early as their mid-20s who have these genes are already showing decreased glucose uptake in the brain, even in their 20s.
Oh,
And this
wow.
is something like people that have Alzheimer's disease, they have typically had decreased glucose uptake beginning somewhere 10 to 20 years, maybe even longer, before they start having obvious symptoms. So this is something that's cooking for a long time, so there's a lot of opportunity to try to reverse that situation and potentially prevent or delay or, slow down, the development of Alzheimer's disease like
Yeah.
that.
So, do you feel like it makes a difference when people start these interventions as far as prognosis?
I think, unfortunately, there aren't a huge number of preventive studies yet. Some
Yeah.
of the studies that are kind of relevant relate to people with type 2 diabetes. So there have been some really good, larger studies of people with type 2 diabetes eating a ketogenic diet, for example. And over time, the blood sugar completely normalizes, hemoglobin A1C comes down, their insulin levels come down, they almost always lose weight, and they can completely get off all of their medications, including insulin if they're on insulin. These are type 2 people with type 2 diabetes. And there are several case reports now of people who had diabetes or metabolic syndrome, which is like prediabetes, who also had Alzheimer's disease. And these were people who were put on a ketogenic diet, just aiming for like a mild to moderate level of ketosis, not even a super strict diet. And then they would combine it with exercise and brain training and that type of thing. But there are 3 cases out there, and basically each one of them had over 10 weeks of this diet and this kind of regimen that they went on. They normalized their blood glucose control. That improved. They lost weight. Their blood pressure came down. It really didn't change their cholesterol levels very much. But the most profound thing was that their mini mental status exam score, which is the same test that my husband took, for those clinical trials, improved. There was a man, his score went up from 23 to 29 out of 30 points. 29 is
Wow.
considered normal. And a woman who her score was 21 before she started, and it went up to 28, which is also very close to normal. So these are 2 people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's who, their memory and cognition greatly improved with just 10 weeks of a ketogenic
Wow.
diet. So if you can get, and diabetes too, is one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's. It's about a 30% risk if somebody has type 2 diabetes of developing dementia.
Oh, wow.
So normalizing that, getting the glucose under control could make a huge difference as to whether you are going to decline sooner or later or at
Yeah.
all. Yeah.
Yes, we're hearing and learning a lot more about some of these metabolic connections through whether it's mental health
Mhm.
symptoms, cancer research. So it's just exciting to be putting the dots together and connecting that. And I know there were a lot of really powerful testimonials
Mhm.
in your book. And I'm just curious, what made you decide to collect and publish those testimonials, and any in particular that still stick with you? I know for me, one that stood out was the mother that was remembering the next morning there was cake in the refrigerator. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I started collecting. Well, when Steve improved so much, I started writing to politicians and the news media and all of this, trying to get this information out. Alzheimer's Association, to no avail. Couldn't get any of them to pay any attention to it. And I was just trying to say, there's a medical food that's going to come out in a year, but this is actually on the shelf. By then, I kind of knew, not too long after, that MCT oil was actually also available online. I just didn't know it yet. And we actually did start adding MCT oil to my husband's regimen around 6 weeks. And I started mixing coconut and MCT oil. There's good reasons for both, which we can talk about later. But I was just so obsessed with getting the message out. And there was an Alzheimer's Association conference that was going to come about 2 months after we started Steve on the coconut oil, and I I wrote an article all about what had happened with Steve, explaining about how this works, how to do it. I also had started talking with Dr. Richard Beach, who was a ketone expert at the NIH, and he had been working on a ketone ester, which can get your ketone levels much, much higher. He'd been working on this since the mid 1990s and hadn't really gotten off the ground or been able to get any clinical trials. So I included information about that, that there's something even more. I called it, what if there was a cure for Alzheimer's and no one knew, was the name of the article. And it talked about, that the levels that you would get from coconut and MCT oil or of ketones are much lower than you would get with a ketone ester, So, and he was actually felt like it could be a cure or a preventive, for Alzheimer's. So I wrote this article up intending to pass it out at the Alzheimer's International Conference, which was in Chicago that year. And so I had 1,500 copies printed up in Chicago. I had gotten a table, actually approved at first, for a table that in their big exhibit hall. And it, basically paid for it, everything. Made all of our travel arrangements. My sister and her husband came along with us so they could hang out with Steve. And when a few days before we were supposed to travel, I get an email from the Alzheimer's Association saying, we changed our mind. We decided you cannot have a table. And I was really upset. I argued back and forth with them. I think it's in the book, kind of the back and forth there. And I'm like, this is just a food. It's not a drug, that has potential toxicity. And they had another exhibit from the medical food people. The people with the medical food were going to be exhibiting there. And I said, this is just a case report of their product, basically what happens when you give, these oils that have medium chain triglycerides. And they completely declined. They made up all kinds of flimsy excuses as to why I couldn't have a table. They said, but you can come. You just can't distribute your article. You can't pass it out, give it to anybody. But I managed. We went anyway. We passed out a lot of the extras copies in Chicago. We went to Grant Park and handed them out. We went to health food stores. And my sister, passed out quite a few kind of near the convention center, people coming in, and I would go to look at the posters. There were like 500 or so posters every day of research that people had done, and I looked for people who are interested in insulin resistance, in glucose, in nutrition, fatty acids, anything remotely related. I would stop and talk to them, and then I would hand them a copy. So I did it on the sly. And managed to probably hand out about 200 copies or so.
Great.
Yeah, but anyway, so then after that article got out, then I put it out online. I came home, I started sending it out online, and it just kind of built over time. It started getting more and more attention. There was a local radio show that had me come on after they had seen it. We had put it in health food stores too. I started giving some talks in local health food stores. And then after the radio program, then the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, which is a large regional paper, they asked me to do an interview for a news article. And the article went viral. It had a picture of Steve and I with his 3 clocks. I don't think I showed you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I should show you the other.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so remember the very disorganized, so his second clock, this is 2 weeks later.
Wow.
So
yeah,
the whole
looks
circle.
A lot more like a clock.
Yeah, it's got the numbers. It's still pretty messy, and this was 37 days later.
Wow.
So it's kind of tidy, a little tidier. And I thought, I asked him, what are all those lines? And I thought they were hands of the clock, like too many of them. And he said, no, he was trying to line the numbers up across from each other. He was trying to make it look tidy.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, so after I got this article out online, then I started hearing from people, and and it was and after the St. Pete Times article, because that really got out there. And the first lady that wrote to me was the one that you mentioned. Her mother had Alzheimer's. She was failing very much. She didn't recognize family members. She was in bed, almost all the time. She was barely eating. She was losing weight. She just wasn't doing well at all. And her daughter started giving her coconut oil. I think she started with 2 tablespoons, similar to what Steve was getting. And she said it didn't happen right away. It took about 2 months before she realized that there had been a major change, like gradual change over 2 months. And this lady got up out of bed. She started eating. She started recognizing them. She started smiling and laughing more. And there were a few things that she mentioned that about the cake. She was getting in the refrigerator and they thought she was getting into trouble, And she said, no, I'm looking for that Pepperidge Farm cake that we bought yesterday. And they had bought a Pepperidge Farm cake the day before.
Wow.
And then this lady started reading the newspaper again, which kind of floored her husband. And 6 months later, she started crocheting again.
Oh.
And she ended up living several more years. She died from pneumonia at 83, but she had, enjoyed a lot of time with her granddaughter, who she hadn't recognized. Now she recognized her, and she never did revert back to, where she had been before she started the coconut oil.
Wow.
So that was really profound. And there were so many stories like that. There was a man with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, who was quite incapacitated, and he was using coconut oil for a year before he contacted me. He said he wanted to be sure that it was real and that he hadn't gotten worse. And he had started he upped himself to 9 tablespoons a day. And that's actually, my husband, we slowly worked him up on coconut and MCT oil. He was taking at least that much every day. He was taking some with each meal and with snacks. And we were drinking coconut milk, which has a lot of coconut oil in it. And so this man, he had started doing measurements around his calves, upper arms. People with ALS, they gradually become, I hate to say it, but it's kind of true, paralyzed in a way. They lose their muscle strength becomes extremely weak to the point that they eventually can't eat. They can't feed themselves. Eventually, they can't swallow because of this weakness. And so but you can see the decreases in muscle mass over time. In the arms, legs, really everywhere. So he would measure around each of his lower and upper extremities. Every month he was documenting all of this, and he was doing certain strength tests that he was keeping track of. And over the course of a year, he had improved. He had not declined. And with ALS, it's a neurodegenerative disease. You steadily decline. Most people die within 3 to 5 years. 90%, 80 or 90% die within 3 to 5 years. And he improved enough that he was able to have a knee transplant replacement surgery. He hadn't been able to walk, but then he could again. He could walk and race, and his knee was hurting so much. He needed that, but they said, "Well, you're not walking anyway, so why do it?" But when he could walk again, then he got that surgery, and his knee, over several months as it healed, he was able to walk better. And he stayed in touch with me for about 8 years. And, he actually was very stable for a very long time. And then I lost track of him. So, I worry about what happened. But that was really quite profound.
Yeah.
And there were many stories. Oh my gosh, just so many. But I started keeping track of them when I realized that I was starting to accumulate these emails from people, mostly emails, a few phone calls, but mostly emails. Most of them were for caregivers. Sometimes they were from the person themselves, like this man with ALS. And the local Alzheimer Institute, one of the places that Steve had tested, the Bird Alzheimer Institute at University of South Florida, they became interested in this. And so I started putting these cases on a spreadsheet, and I kept every single one of them. I was the only one getting these emails. Later, I had help. So at that point, I knew that I was getting every single report, whether a person had or had not responded, for example, because some people tried it and they would write me that they didn't see anything, they didn't see any response.
Okay.
And in those, the trials of that medical food, it was almost half the people that did respond, the other half didn't. So I didn't really expect everybody to respond. But they suggested that they could use my case reports to help get a study going. And they actually did get funding for a study of coconut oil. And unfortunately, they had trouble recruiting. They wanted to recruit 65 people, and they were only able to recruit 10 over a couple of years because people knew coconut oil was on the shelf and they didn't want to get the placebo. If you're in a clinical trial, there's a chance that you won't get the intervention.
Wow. Okay.
And they had a lot of trouble talking people into it. They just wanted to go out and buy it and do it themselves. But they did get funding for the study. So that's how it started.
That's exciting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I had about 60 or so when they applied for the grant and got it. And then I just kept, going with it. And eventually I accumulated 360 reports. This was between like 2008 and 2014. And I stopped after that because I did have other people. My sister was helping, my daughters were helping with my emails, and I just couldn't be sure I was getting every single case. But I had an opportunity in 2023. I decided to submit, I was encouraged by one of the ketone researchers, why don't you put these case reports, try to do a poster presentation, or maybe try to write it up in an article to get published. And they're anecdotal reports. There isn't a lot. That's supposed to be one of the weaker forms of evidence. In the medical world, but this was a huge number of anecdotal reports. So I decided to focus on the people who had memory issues, and there were 288 of the 360 that had Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's with dementia, autism. There were a few younger people that had autism, and just mild cognitive impairment, which is very common in older age. And I was able to tabulate, from them, like how many reported improvement at all, like any kind of improvement. And then I used phrases from the emails to try to look at what kinds of improvements they reported. And it did get accepted as a poster presentation at the Alzheimer's International Conference, and this was in Amsterdam in 2023. So I got to go to Amsterdam to present it, and I had a second poster that they approved too about kind of a personalized plan for ketogenic, strategies to try to slow cognitive decline, basically, is what that one was about. And so I got to present posters like 2 days in a row, and I talked to so many people when I did that. And then I got an invitation from the this European Society of Medicine for their journal, Medical Research Archives, to publish it as an article. And they were very generous with allowing me to have like a really long article explaining everything that I could about this whole idea behind Alzheimer's and how ketones could benefit, and how each of the certain fatty acids in coconut oil could benefit the brain, and then present my case reports. So it's actually published, and it's been really an interesting journey, with trying to get the message out, and then of course writing the books, trying to do that, and getting on social media and doing podcasts.
Yes, I'm so grateful to have you here for that. But this might be a great time to talk about, you mentioned earlier, the benefits of blending coconut oil with MCT oil.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit more about that, and, adding exogenous ketones versus
Right.
using a keto diet, or combining the two.
Combining. I'm really big about combining ketogenic strategies. So, Yeah, so when I first started talking with Dr. Veach, he was so shocked that somebody just taking coconut oil would have the response that my husband had. He thought that it would require much, much higher levels of ketones, and he'd been working on that ketone ester, and his ester could get you from 0 ketones to 5 millimole in 30 minutes, and 5 millimole is 10 times higher than what you would get with coconut or MCT oil,
Wow.
you know, potentially. And so when he heard that Steve responded to coconut oil, he was really shocked. I had been talking to him. I kind of was, my first call was more, I asked them more theoretical questions, but I already knew, my husband had improved. And I asked about coconut oil. He said, no, the levels would never be high enough. So then 2 weeks, when Steve drew that second clock, I sent him both clocks. I faxed them to him, and he was shocked. He called me and he said, well, that is unexpected. And he became extremely interested in this, and he put me in touch with some of the really the big figures in ketone research from the 1960s, the ones who had studied MCT oil and found out that it converted to ketones, and another Dr. George Cahill, who had discovered that the brain uses ketones during starvation and fasting. These were men that this work was going on in the 1960s, and they had written papers with Dr. Veach, hypothesis papers about how ketones could benefit people with Alzheimer's. So to actually have a case, this was like Steve was the first person, a case of Alzheimer's of somebody who had actually responded that they were aware of. And then, so I kept in touch with all of them over time, but Dr. Veach measured Steve's ketone levels. He had to send samples. The lab at my hospital cooperated greatly. They froze immediately the samples when they drew them from Steve and overnighted them, to the NIH, and they ran the levels. And so the first round was with coconut oil, and Steve took 35 grams, a little over 2 tablespoons in the morning, and then Dr. Veach said, let's do a second one in the evening at dinner. And his ketone levels did go up, and it wasn't hugely, but the interesting thing was, instead of peaking at 90 minutes like MCT oil, it was 3 hours is where it peaked, and there was still a ketone level at dinner time. We had checked it right before he had the second dose, and then after dinner his level actually was rising pretty steeply 3 hours later, and we didn't measure after that, so I have no idea how high the levels got. But I suspect, having ketones that late in the evening heading up, that would be a good thing to go to sleep with, since the brain uses so much energy. And then a couple weeks later, he had him do it again with MCT oil, and this time his level was higher. It did peak at 90 minutes, and it did come down at about 3 hours, back to the baseline, just as in that patent application, the other people. And so Dr. Veach said, well, why don't you just forget about the coconut oil and just give them MCT oil, because the levels are higher. And I said, but he improved with coconut oil. There might be something else about it. And one of the other researchers, Dr. Theodore Van Italy, he said the same thing to me. He said there might be other things about coconut oil that are working here, besides the ketones. And so I decided to just start mixing the two. And so I kind of tried different mixtures to see what worked best, and basically like a 4-to-3 ratio, 4 parts MCT to 3 parts coconut oil. So if you're mixing it, it would be 4 ounces of MCT to 3 ounces of coconut oil. I tend to make bigger volumes at a time. That stays liquid at room temperature, and it will work in almost any kind of food, cold or hot. You can blend it into almost anything. And so I started giving that to Steve. And I was also still cooking with whole coconut, virgin coconut oil, certain things like low heat, scrambling eggs, and, putting it on vegetables and, things like that. Um, Steve did continue to steadily improve. I told you at 2 months, his gait improved and he could tie his shoes. With 3 months, 3.5 months, he hadn't been able to read for about a year and a half. And he announced one day that he could read again. And I said, well, why couldn't you read? And he said, because the words would shake around on the page. He said it was like satellite breakup was how he described it, where it would kind of break up and the words would move around on the page. And that had stopped at about 3.5 months, and he could actually read again. So he started reading again, and then he started, he felt like he was comprehending better. And around 9 or 10 months, he started remembering what he'd read several hours earlier. So his improvement really continued steadily for about 10 months and then seemed to kind of level off after that. The whole thing was really quite profound. He improved so much that he was able to work as a volunteer at the hospital. He worked in the supply, where I worked. He worked in the supply warehouse, and he would put stickers on the different supplies, and he would help with the deliveries to the different floors. And it made him feel really useful again. It was a big deal for him. He was just so bummed out that he couldn't work. And then he became eventually bummed out that he was volunteering and not making money for it. But yeah, it was pretty sweet at the time. But, the whole thing was really pretty profound. And he did get into the clinical trial, both of them. He ended up testing for the other one again, and then he got a score of 20 when he tested the second time for the other study. And he got so we decided to do this oral medication, and that removes beta amyloid plaque from the brain. It turned out to be a disaster, but not right away, because Steve turned out to be on the placebo for the first 18 months, and it was a crossover study. So eventually we knew he would get on it. That was why we chose that particular one. But he was on the placebo, and during that first year, he had a lot of testing. And he gained, there was an Alzheimer's disease test that was 75 points, which is memory and cognition. He gained 6 points on that test during the year out of 75 points. There's one called Activities of Daily Living. It's like, how well can you take care of yourself? How well do you function? And he gained 14 out of 70 points. He improved by over a year. And the other people, like, eventually they published the results of that drug trial, and the other people on placebo declined in both of those, over that year. And so, but the unfortunate thing that happened at 18 months, we found out later, Steve crossed over to the medication, and we strongly suspected that he was on it because his hair started to grow out like a light gold color. Like it was like a ribbon growing out in his hair, and that was one of the side effects of this drug. But then he had other side effects. He had some setbacks. He started doing some strange things that he had, he kind of started reverting back, and he had an infection, which turned out to be a common complication of this medication. He started wandering a little bit, looking for his brothers, going down the road. That was really worrisome, and I thought, what is going on? And he had an abrasion on his shin that took a month to heal, and this was another, poor wound healing was another complication of this drug. He fainted, what he had never done in his life. So I decided to pull him out of the study. Steve, totally agreed. And then Dr. Veach, he had done toxicity testing on his ketone ester at that point. He had completed the testing. It had done very well. They had over 2,000 doses given and only 6 episodes of side effects, which were mostly upset stomach. I think 1 case or 2 of diarrhea, something like that, out of 2,000 doses. So he said, why don't we give this ketone ester to Steve and see if we can get him back, where he was, get him back to at least where he was. And he sent me this raw material. It was the most horrible thing I've ever tasted in my life. They talk about it tasting like jet fuel. And so they suggested I dilute it and try different flavors and things with it. And there weren't too many that worked very well. But Steve drank it, and he was like a trooper. He knew he had Alzheimer's. He knew what all of this was about. We had talked about it so much. He had talked on the phone to Dr. Veach, and he was, ready, willing, and able, to take this. And he shuddered when he drank it. But I videotaped him for 2 straight hours, after he took the first dose. And he had not been able to write out the alphabet for quite a long time. This is what he decided he wanted to do. He said, I want to write out the alphabet. And first he sang it from beginning to end. And then after he sang it, then he was able to write it. It took him about 20 minutes. He tried over and over. He would kind of get midway through and stop, and then a little further and stop. Finally, he wrote out the whole alphabet. He was elated. He was so excited. And he started talking about things that happened to him when he was a kid, that he laughed and talked about his poor penmanship and cursed his first grade teacher for that, by name, remembering her name. It was really quite something. And part of his setback was that he was starting to need more help doing real basic things like taking a shower. He had been able to, take a shower all by himself, just automatically do it all. And as part of the setback, I had to talk him through step by step, okay, wet your hair, okay, put the shampoo in, now rub it around, okay, now rinse it out, The next day, he took a shower. I didn't even know he was doing it. He took a shower, picked out the right clothes, and came into the kitchen and all by himself and shaved.
Wow.
Needing help, just talking him through shaving and everything, And he could do all of the stuff automatically again. And really all of the new changes that we had seen during the 6 weeks that he was on that medication, that they all reverted back to where he was before he had gotten that, so he improved again, and then he was very stable for another 20 months. And we got, after we stopped the clinical trial a few months later, I got a call from the research center, and they notified us that they had stopped the study because they found that the drug actually accelerated Alzheimer's disease. It actually increased atrophy in the brain. It removed plaques and tangles and increased atrophy. So the people who had gotten it had gotten worse. And they told me that the people that they suspected were on it because of the hair color change during the first year had gotten much worse during that time. Fortunately, Steve was on the placebo, or I wouldn't be talking to you now, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I appreciate, in one of your books, I think it was the complete book of Ketones, just how you shared your gratitude for him getting accepted into that, which is what helped you find all of this. And I just appreciate just your journey and the passion and enthusiasm which you carry this information forward, helping others to learn from what you've learned. So I just appreciate all of that. But something else in your book that was surprising to me that I think might be helpful for listeners is talking about current, very common medications and their connection.
Yeah.
So many people think they're safe because their doctor prescribed them, that they're okay to be on long term. Can you shed some light on current medications that are being prescribed long term and how they may increase our risk?
Yeah. So these are some things that we found out by trial and error, unfortunately. And Steve donated his brain, and we found out that he had Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. It's a combination. It's the second most common dementia. Most people don't know it. A lot of doctors barely know what it is, if at all. It's similar to Parkinson's disease. They have a different type of plaque in addition to the Alzheimer's plaques. And so some of his tremors and his slow gait and all that were related to that. But when you have Lewy body dementia, for example, there are certain medications that will cause you to develop Parkinson's disease if you, don't have the symptoms. It will worsen the symptoms. People that have Parkinson's, it will greatly worsen their symptoms. And so these are antipsychotics, for example. And Haldol, he had an unfortunate experience, like a bad reaction to Valium. A doctor, a geriatric specialist who claimed to be an Alzheimer's specialist, Steve had gotten into a little bit of a problem going to bed. He would sometimes say, you need to take me back to my place. And it's like, we're at your place. I mean, it's really common. And so he said, well, let's just give him like half of a Valium to kind of relax him, and that may help. And after about 3 weeks, first he had like this kind of outbreak, like a sweating episode, and I didn't really tie it to the Valium. But then he had a really severe episode where you act out your dream. And this is something that can happen with Valium. You know, you wake up, you're acting out, and it was he became violent for the first time ever. He took a lamp and kind of hit it against the wall like a Tiffany lamp, and he had never ever done anything like that. It was really frightening, and you know, basically he ended up in the hospital. You know, he was really, it was scary, and then figured it out that it was Valium, but they started giving him antipsychotics. They gave him Haldol, and I it found out later two other antipsychotics they also were giving him that they didn't even tell me about. I'm a physician. This is the hospital
Wow.
that I worked in, and they didn't even tell me, you know, what exactly they were giving him. And he was in the hospital for about 2 weeks, and he developed a really severe tremor. His hand was shaking so hard you could hear it, and they weren't getting him up to walk. And then when he finally was able to, he was so stiff he was bent over. It was just horrible. The whole thing was just so horrible, and I ended up pulling him out of the hospital, you know, because you know he was declining rapidly, and he had been walking, talking, eating, you know, fine, you know, before this happened, and suddenly he was like completely incapacitated. It was just incredible. And they told a young man, he was like what they call a sitter. He would stay with Steve overnight. And they told him that he was dying and that I was just in denial about it. But I couldn't
Wow.
convince them. I kept saying, you know, I was reading up on it, and I'm like, these are side effects of Haldol, you know. And there's one called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. He was having these massive sweating episodes, massive diarrhea, and soaking the bed. They kept changing the bed, and they kept giving him more Haldol. I'm like, please don't give it to him. And I got his medical records later and found out that as soon as I would leave at 9:30 in the evening, they would come in and give it to him, even though I had asked them not to give it to him. It was really bad,
Wow.
and so you know, I basically pulled him out of the hospital, and then it took about 6 weeks for him to recover. You know, till he was back upright, walking fine. He had developed a problem called akathisia, where you can't sit still. It's can be a side effect of Valium or these antipsychotics. And night terrors is what the Valium, the side effect is called, you know, that he had experienced with Valium. So, but, you know, for people with Alzheimer's, there's this whole group of medications, common medications, that do the exact opposite of what the Alzheimer's medications are intended to do. So there's a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, very important. It's involved in many different functions, but learning and memory are a big part of it, and it's deficient in people with Alzheimer's disease. And part of that is choline, acetylcholine. So choline is one of the substances that we're supposed to eat. I think it's around 450 to 550 milligrams a day, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. But most people in the U.S., probably, I think more than half don't get that much. A lot of people don't even know what it is. They've never heard of it. But it's part of this important neurotransmitter. And it's also part of every single cell membrane in your body. It's very rich in the brain, choline is. But there are a bunch of different drugs that are anticholinergic. So the Alzheimer's drugs try to increase acetylcholine, the ones that are approved. This is Aricept, Exelon, Namenda. They increase acetylcholine in the brain. There are these classes of drugs that are anticholinergic. So anti-choline, basically, they have exactly the opposite effect. They suppress the production of acetylcholine in the brain. So you're basically fighting, if you're taking Alzheimer's medications and you take an anticholinergic drug, you're depressing the production of acetylcholine. So these are really common drugs, certain types of antidepressants, SSRIs, cold medications like for decongestants, cough medications, drugs that are used to help with people that have urinary retention. It's very common elderly people to be taking these types of things. Sleep aids, these common sleep aids, Benadryl. There's one called doxylamine. It's a comes separately as a sleep aid, but it's also in like NyQuil and that type of thing. So a lot of people are taking several different of these medications. There's a case report of a lady that she came in completely and utterly confused, and she was taking 7 different anticholinergic medications, and she had known dementia, but she had gotten much, much, much worse. And then they realized that she's on all of these different anticholinergic medications, certain ones that for diarrhea, not all of them, but certain ones are like that, so people can be taking these and not realize that they're actually, um, completely doing something contradictory to what you're trying to do by taking an Alzheimer medication.
Oh, wow.
And it can mimic
Do you,
symptoms. They develop, and statins too are another one that can increase confusion.
yeah, and I'm curious about that too for people who don't have Alzheimer's. Does taking some of these drugs increase the risk for that?
It can increase our confusion. Yeah,
Okay.
they can become confused, and you know, people might think that they have dementia, and maybe they don't. It could just be the
Ah,
medication. And when somebody goes on a statin, and they can develop confusion while on a statin, if they stop it, it usually will go away.
okay.
You know,
Yeah, I've
so
heard of
yeah.
that. And so, what would you recommend for people as far as having a conversation with their doctors if they are on some of these drugs and concerned about that?
Yeah, I think they might point this out to their doctor. The American Geriatrics Association, they have a big, it's a full-length article that's available online about all of these different drugs. There are other ones too that are worrisome, but these are really kind of the most common drugs, the ones that we've talked about, that people need to worry about. But like steroids too, taking
Oh,
prednisone over
yeah.
and over, it decreases glucose uptake into the part of the brain that where Alzheimer's starts. So you're basically increasing insulin resistance, or something is going on. It's decreasing glucose uptake in these areas that really need a lot of glucose because it has to do with memory and learning. You know, so I just strongly advise, like any physician who wants to learn more about this, all they need to do is look on PubMed and find American Geriatrics Association. It's a really they update it every so many years, and they talk at length about the different drugs and what kind of effects they can have in this way, that may increase, maybe worsen dementia or mimic, dementia, symptoms of dementia. Not to mention other, negative side effects for the elderly population. There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, would you generally think that it's a good idea for people to be using these strategies as a prevention tool? And is there anyone that wouldn't benefit from this?
Yeah. I can't think of too many people that wouldn't benefit. I mean, some people, like somebody who actually has liver failure or cirrhosis of the liver,
Okay.
would not be able to, might not be able to make ketones where they're made in the liver from the oils. They might not be able to process that normally. And there are a few people that have like genetic defects that increase their ketones. They could go into ketoacidosis, but those are really rare, so
Okay.
they're really rare genetic mutations that somebody has, that they're already prone to developing ketosis. And so people worry about diabetic ketoacidosis. If they do coconut oil or MCT oil, are they going to develop diabetic ketoacidosis? Well, number one, first you have to have type 1 diabetes for that to happen, and possibly really severe type 2 diabetes on a lot of insulin. But basically, what happens in diabetic ketoacidosis? Your blood glucose is extremely high. You have no insulin. So this would really mainly apply to people with type 1 diabetes, that they might be in a situation where they have no insulin. They didn't give themselves their insulin dose, basically. And the ketone levels, the fat starts breaking down. Like the cells can't use glucose at all. Most cells, when there's no insulin, they just can't use glucose. And so the fat starts breaking down very rapidly. It starts pouring out, ketones, the liver does, and the ketone levels become extremely high. So we talked about like a ketone ester getting it up to 5 millimoles. With diabetic ketoacidosis, it can get up to 20, 25 millimoles. I mean, many, many times higher. Coconut oil, zero point 0.5, MCT oil, maybe 1 millimole, and we're talking massive amounts of ketones with diabetic ketoacidosis. So taking something like coconut MCT oil, a low carb diet, exercise, things like that that induce ketones aren't going to put somebody into diabetic ketoacidosis. I mean, unless maybe you're a type 1 diabetic who hasn't taken their insulin and you're on the verge of it, I just think that situation would be extremely unlikely.
Okay.
So that's, basically one, some people who might have to worry about it, but basically, if you take a ketone ester, it does it elevates the ketone levels very quickly. So I recommend that people not stack doses too close together because it can take several hours for that acid, the acid from the ketones to actually go back to normal again. If you stack the doses too much, you could push the ketone level into the range of ketoacidosis. Like we're talking large doses, like probably 30 to 50 grams could put you into that range, and maybe taking that much again a couple hours later could really push up your ketone level too high, which would not be good. But it's different than diabetic ketoacidosis, because when you take a ketone ester, the level starts coming down very quickly. Like an hour later, it will be quite a bit lower than it was when it peaked, around 30, 35 minutes. And, so it's temporary, but if somebody is in that situation, they probably should go to the emergency room, not take a chance.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think, the biggest problem, I think, in our world today, especially in the US, is the diet and how poor it is, how loaded it is with sugar, how loaded it is with ultra processed foods that have so many synthetic ingredients, so much high fructose corn syrup, and fats that aren't so great for us, and that type of thing. And so I think it kind of behooves everybody, if they want to avoid getting dementia and age in a more healthy way, to really look closely at their diet and just to cut out, the unnecessary sugars, that are in the diet, sweet. It kind of depends on the sweetener. I think like monk fruit seems to be okay. Stevia is probably okay. There's some worry. The ones that are more synthetic, like erythritol, has had some not such good results in certain testing, and there's concern that some of these sweeteners, even though they don't provide calories, they don't provide glucose, that they seem in some people to increase their insulin level, to spike their insulin level. So I think that's something that's a little bit individual in some ways. I tend to use stevia mostly. I try to minimize it, but I used a continuous monitor for 2 weeks, which that's another thing that I think people might find a very interesting thing, way to find out for themselves, how they respond to what they're eating. And it was really great. I didn't seem to have any increase in glucose related to stevia at all. My levels, I was very pleased because of the type of diet. I eat really a whole food, Mediterranean type diet, but higher fat, lower carb. Like I eat really minimal portions. Like if I have whole grains, it's a really small amount, like a quarter cup of whole grain rice or something like that. Part of a sweet potato, maybe, but so my levels just kind of went just up a little bit after I ate and down, just kind of floated along. When somebody has a blood sugar spike after a high carb meal, it goes, boy, it just skyrockets, and then tends to come down fairly quickly too. And I only had that happen one time in the 2 weeks, and it was I on purpose. I did this because maybe twice a year when I go to a movie, I'll decide to have nachos. The chips with the cheese.
Oh,
And I thought,
yes.
I just want to see what happens. And it spiked. It really spiked. I was shocked. It was like the only really big spike that I had during that whole 2 weeks.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
well, that's not something I want to get in the habit of doing ever again.
Yeah, sounds like it's a really good way to get that
It is
feedback.
because you can document,
Yeah.
what you've eaten. There's one that you can get on Amazon. It's called Stello. It's made by Dexcom, but it's for
Mm,
people who don't have diabetes. So anybody can buy this, and they have an
okay.
app to go with it, and you can keep track on the app of what you've eaten or what changed, something that you did, to kind of see like exercise or something like that. So it's really a kind of a neat way to really assess what you're doing, how well you're doing, with your diet. As far as your blood glucose control, it's really pretty cool. The one caution about it, it measures interstitial fluid, not blood, and that tends to
Mm.
run like 10 to 20 milligrams higher than your blood sugar. So when I
Oh,
first put it on, I
interesting.
thought, wait a minute, my blood sugar's never this high. and and then when I really
Ah.
read the instructions, it pointed that out. It said that's it's going to run higher than what your blood glucose does.
Ah, good to know. Do you supplement with MCT and
Oh
coconut
yeah,
oil
yeah,
yourself?
and all the other exogenous ketone supplements too. So basically, I eat the Mediterranean diet, low carb. I do overnight fasting for usually 14 hours or so, 14 to 16 hours. I usually don't eat after around 8 in the evening, and then my first kind of solid meal is around 12 or 1 in the afternoon. In the morning, in my coffee, I put it's MCT and coconut oil powder, which blends in really well. And the overnight fast will put you into mild ketosis. Adding an MCT, like that, or coconut oil and or MCT oil, will further increase your ketone level. And the longer you fast, the higher the level goes. So I do that. I probably average about like somewhere between 3 and 5 tablespoons a day of coconut oil and or the coconut MCT mixture. I still make that for myself. I started doing all of this when Steve did. I thought if it could help somebody with Alzheimer's, it might be able to prevent it. And I have a really, really strong family history, both sides of my family, relatives that have had Alzheimer's. So I've been doing this myself ever since. And and then the ketone supplements. So I tend not to favor one over the other. There's a number of them out there now, and there are different price points. Some people can't stand the taste of one; they like the other. You know, um, so I kind of just take an approach where I use all of them. I try not to play favorites. I have a lot of the people that own the companies are real interested in what I do with them. But so I'll take ketone ester. At one time the flavor has improved dramatically since my husband was taking it, and it still isn't wonderful, but it's really not. It's very tolerable. So I'll do like KE4, one day. There's another ketone ester. It's a combination of butanediol and C8, one of the MCTs. Um, and that one is comes as a flavorless powder. I don't know. Do you want to talk brands or not? Would you rather not? Yeah, 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 yeah. So KE4 is really the ester that my husband took, and that turned him around so well. And there are many anecdotal reports, some studies in progress. People with Alzheimer's taking 5 grams, 10 grams, and seeing improvement with it. When Dr. Veach, when we did it with my husband, it was 25 grams 3 times a day. It was a really, really hefty dose. And it did get his levels up to like 4 to 5 millimoles. Um, but, we didn't know if he needed that much or not. We just didn't know where to start because he was the first one to ever get something like this. But I have reports from people taking just 5 or 10 grams, once or twice a day that are seeing improvements. And then they tend to up it. It's on the expensive side. So, some people give as much as they can afford, basically.
Gotcha.
And then, so this C8, this flavorless powder is really pretty amazing. It's C8, which is one of the medium chain triglycerides linked to butanediol, which is one of the components of the ketone ester that Dr. Veach developed. And they linked it together as an ester. And it's just a powder. You can mix it in coffee. So I'll have that sometimes. It's a tiny bit bitter, but coffee's on the bitter side. It doesn't really change the taste that much. It's really pretty amazing. And then there's another product called Kinetic, where they mix the two components of Dr. Veach's ketone ester, but separately. They're just mixed together instead of linked together as a molecule. And this one has kind of a tart. It works really well as kind of a tart drink. And they've got several different flavors out now, I believe. That one's called Kinetic, and they're all available, online. I think Amazon carries them. The flavorless powder is called Ketone. It's Kitone, and you just
Okay.
ketone.com. It took me a minute when I saw the name. I thought I didn't even recognize it as ketone. It was Kitone, and
Gotcha.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the ketone salts. The Prove It company has a huge number of flavors of ketone salts. So these are the ketone, the main one that you're trying to, like during starvation, beta hydroxybutyrate, but it's bound with sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And there's another product, Keto Start, also that is very good, that has all 4 of those minerals. Well, we need all of those minerals every day. So it's kind of a great way to get ketones and get these minerals. So there are, and there are a lot of different companies have come out with ketone salts, but I tend to encourage taking the ones that have these 4 different electrolytes. Like some are all sodium or all potassium. Well, that's not good. Like if you have high blood pressure or you're on the verge of it, taking too much sodium can not be a great thing. It will sometimes increase blood pressure in people that are salt sensitive, sodium sensitive. Uh, and Right, and then some people, like if you take one that's really high in potassium, especially older people, they might already be taking a potassium supplement, taking diuretics or something like that. And it is possible to get too much potassium. It can be really harmful. So I think it's better to use this more balanced approach, getting sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium with a ketone salt product. There's kind of a limit to how much you can take because of these minerals that are in it. The levels aren't quite as high as you would get with the ketone ester. Like say for the same, like if you took the same amount of a ketone ester as a salt, you might go up to say 4 or 5 millimoles with the ketone ester and maybe 1.5 or 2 with the ketone salt. But there still seems to be value to it. And I kind of think of coconut and MCT oil as part of the diet. They are foods. They can be used as foods to help maintain like a constant level of ketones, and using the ketone supplements to try to enhance, like boost the level up, for a period of time. All of them last for several hours, the ketone level before it comes back down again. And somebody that's having memory issues, I think, they may be especially valuable, for that situation too. But a lot of athletes use them, and people have lost a huge amount of weight taking these products as well. Ketones tend to suppress appetite, so they, in that way, can be really helpful, for somebody that, wants to lose weight, and it helps increase lean muscle mass and decrease fat mass. It's really pretty interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So, how can people reach you for more information?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's coconutketones.com. It's COCONUTKETONES.com. No Y in ketones. And I do
Okay.
have an email, like a contact that people can contact me through, if they have questions. And I have links to all of my books on there, a whole bunch of information. I've had this website since 2008. And there's a page for Alzheimer's and dementia. There's another page for basically ketogenic low carb diets. There's you can print out, a low carb diet, and links to the supplements, links to books that I recommend. There's a whole bunch of stuff on it. Probably too much stuff on it.
But great. It sounds like a lot of valuable resources for people wanting to know more. If they have questions or may even have a testimonial for you, they can reach you through
Yes,
that
I
email.
still get
So
testimonials. People are still
I
writing
love
to
that.
me. Yeah.
I love that. It's very inspiring to hear them all in your book. Well, Dr. Mary Newport, I want to thank you so much for your time today, for your wisdom and all the passion and enthusiasm that you have in carrying this very important, valuable message forward. Thank you again for all that you do, your
Oh,
contributions. And then
and
to,
thank you,
yeah, go
Danielle, for
ahead.
having me on, letting me to spread the message.
Oh, of course. Oh, absolutely. It's truly an
Thank
honor to
you.
have you here today. And a special thank you to all of our listeners who tuned in. Please like, subscribe, share this video with people who you feel may benefit from it. And as always, take care.